and we want to get started about talking about how we ensure that finance can actually serve society, which is why we're all here today. So good morning everyone, and we really appreciate you joining us both in person. This is Positive Money's first event for almost 3 years, so do bear with us if there's a few hiccups. We haven't done this for a while. And welcome everyone to those joining online via Zoom and Facebook. We're so pleased that you could join us today. So I'm here to chair the event. I'm Fran Boyd, I'm the Exec Director of Positive Money. And we are launching a report today, The Power of Big Finance, How to Reclaim Our Democracy from the Banking Lobby. Now, no matter which part of the UK we're from or what we do for a living, we all want politicians to act in good faith, have fair judgment and work for the public interest. But as the research we are releasing today in the report shows, powerful financial firms are exerting substantial influence over the policymaking process, resulting in an oversized finance sector which doesn't serve society. A symptom of this was illustrated yesterday by the TUC releasing figures that show bonuses in the financial and insurance sector grew by almost 30% in the last year, while average wages at the same time grew by just 4%. And in March, nearly 6 billion was paid out in city bonuses. We at Positive Money have spent the last 10 years showing how our banking and financial sector fails to serve the public interest and providing alternatives that would help transform the system. But those alternatives are unlikely to be taken up if there are too many financial ties between big finance and parliamentarians. And looking at the big challenges of our time, addressing the cost of living scandal, climate change, and levelling up harsh inequalities, how are we meant to address these if there's a revolving door between finance and government, and if their lobbying power means that when they oppose important reforms, they usually win? In short, we can't, and our democracy is at stake. So I'd like to encourage you all to join the conversation on Twitter. We are using the hashtag #StopTheBankingLobby. So please, those in the audience and online, get involved. And I'd like to welcome our excellent speakers, those here and those hopefully coming on the topic. We have Alison Thulis, who is the SNP's Shadow Treasury spokesperson and is the MP for Glasgow Central. She's also a member of the Treasury Select Committee. We have David Barnes, the lead author of the report we're launching today, The Power of Big Finance, and a senior economist at Positive Money. We hope to be joining us soon, Clive Lewis, who is the Labour MP for Norwich South. He is a member of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, the co-chair of the Green New Deal APPG, and vice chair of the APPG on Limits to Growth. And we also hope that Baroness Susan Kramer will be joining us shortly. She is the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for the Treasury and the Economy in the House of Lords. We did have a Conservative MP confirmed, but unfortunately they pulled out yesterday, so feeling they were uncomfortable with some of the findings in the report, as I'm sure many parliamentarians could be. And also we had Grace Bakley, the economist, join us, but unfortunately she couldn't join us this morning. So we've gone from a small to a large, back to a normal sized panel, hopefully. But there's going to be a full-on discussion, and we're very keen to involve everyone that's here today in person and everyone that is online. So there'll be plenty of time for getting involved with Q&A and also with a poll that we're going to be doing. So I would like to hand over to our lead author, David, to introduce the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. So I'll jump right in. So it's no secret that the financial sector gets favorable treatment from policymakers. Over the past decade, we've learned that when the banks get bailed out, we get austerity. When they get tax cuts, we get tax rises. When they get bumper profits and big bonuses, we get stagnant wages. And right now, in the midst of a cost of living crisis and on the brink of a recession, the government is planning on passing legislation that will deregulate big finance, further consolidating its economic and political power. So why is this? Why is it that economic policymaking prizes the growth of the City of London above other regions of the country and sectors of the economy? Why is it that the financial sector is allowed to neglect our communities and small businesses and drown households in debt just to feed its own growth? Why is it that financial institutions are allowed to gamble away our livelihoods and our futures and face no repercussions? The answer, simply put, is that the financial sector is the most powerful interest group in the country. In this report, we illustrate the extent of this political power, identifying 5 channels through which the financial sector exerts substantial, disproportionate influence over policymakers. So I'll now run through a few slides with some of the key findings from our report. So first, financial institutions derive political power from their direct financial ties with policymakers. We found that in 2020 and 2021, financial institutions and individuals closely tied to the sector donated £15.3 million to political parties and spent an additional £2.3 million directly on MPs. And here you can see a breakdown of the political party donations, quite clearly Conservatives at the top, receiving 76% of all donations from the city. And for MPs that provided services in exchange for their payments, the average hourly rate was £2,738. This is 10 times the average managing director wage in the financial sector and 63 times the average financial sector worker wage. These financial ties are even more widespread in the House of Lords, where 20% of all peers hold paid positions in the financial sector, and that includes over 50% of peers on the Economic Affairs Committee, which is responsible for investigating matters related to economics and finance. Second, financial sector firms and their lobby groups promote their interests through their own lobbying activities. So as you can see in this pie chart, we found that close to 1/3 of all Treasury Minister meetings are with financial institutions in the dark purple and their lobby groups in the bright green. And this is far more than any other sector or interest group in the economy. We also found that 18 finance lobby groups had a combined annual turnover of over £145 million in the last financial year. And this is on top of the 115 million spent from the City of London Corporation's City Cash Fund. And it's also on top of individual financial institutions' own lobbying resources. Third, private finance derives power from the revolving doors it maintains with the financial sector. We found that every single former Chancellor of the Exchequer went on, in the past 40 years, has taken on a private finance role after leaving office, even though only 3 of them worked in private finance before becoming Chancellor. And on average, firms that hired a former Chancellor benefited from a 59% increase in meetings with government departments. We then found that close to 3/4 of all past and present Bank of England decision makers on the central bank's key committees have worked in private finance before, during, or after their time in public policy making. Fourth, financial institutions and their allies in government build political support for the sector through the dissemination of positive narratives. They refer to the sector as the engine of the wider economy. They claim that they've provided unprecedented support to struggling customers throughout the pandemic, and they present themselves as a potential solution to environmental breakdown. We argue that these narratives they deeply misrepresent the overall behavior and impact of the UK financial sector, which, as you can see here, has far more corporate legal violations than any other sector in the economy. This is data from Corporate Violations Tracker from the Transparency Task Force and Good Jobs First. And as you can see here, the financial sector has also neglected investment in small businesses. In grey, you have lending that's going towards mortgages, debt outstanding mortgages, and then in light purple, you have lending that's going towards the financial sector. We also show that large financial institutions have failed to provide adequate support to vulnerable customers throughout the pandemic and have continued to finance fossil fuels to the tune of tens of billions of pounds annually. Although the sector is not sufficiently serving the public interest or tackling climate change, the economy is nonetheless dependent on a stable financial system, and the sector derives further political power from this dependence. So the big banks are still too big to fail. As you can see here, the biggest 5 banks in the UK account for 70% of total banking assets, and they provide vital services that our economies cannot function without, right? So there's no doubt about it. We are still dependent on the banks, and this means that policymakers tend to often naturally align with their policy preferences, even regardless of lobbying efforts. So that's all in terms of findings. So no more slides. Now I'll turn to the good news, which is that none of this is inevitable. We don't have to accept this state of affairs. We've outlined 12 recommendations in this report aimed at improving transparency, tackling conflicts of interest, slowing the revolving door, establishing a regulatory framework that works in the public interest, and reducing our dependence on private financial institutions. So, for example, on transparency, we recommend extending the lobbying register to cover in-house lobbyists in addition to consultant lobbyists. Currently, it only covers consultant lobbyists, who do the minority of lobbying in this country. On conflicts of interest, we recommend banning private sector second jobs for MPs. On the revolving door, we recommend a statutory body is established to oversee more stringent rules on cool-off periods and lobbying bans for former policymakers. On the regulatory framework, we want the government to discard its plans to introduce an international competitiveness objective and instead introduce objectives on financial inclusion and alignment with the Paris Agreement. And to minimize our economic dependence on the banks and card companies, we propose a fair and inclusive digital payment method provided as a public utility, as well as a more diverse ecosystem of banks that serve local needs and communities. So to conclude, it's clear that policymakers prioritize big finance over the public interest time and time again. They do this because they have financial ties to big finance, because they're lobbied disproportionately by big finance, because they step through the revolving door with big finance, because they buy into false narratives about the impacts of big finance, and because our economy is dependent on the stability of big finance. But again, it doesn't have to be this way. We can and we must wrestle power from the banks, investment firms, hedge funds, and insurance companies, and put our financial system to good use, channeling finance towards a fair and sustainable economy. This is, we think, central to restoring faith in the institution that we're gathered in today. And it's necessary if we're genuinely going to achieve financial policymaking that helps us level up the country, tackle climate change, and redress the deepening inequalities that are holding us back. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I'll bring you back into the conversation in a bit. I want to bring in Alison now. Your reaction to the report, particularly in the context of you being on the Treasury Select Committee and the current legislation on financial services, and also your perspective from SNP and Scotland.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me along, and thank you, David, for your excellent report. And I suppose when I start from this and looking at this report, is as an outsider as well. I haven't ever worked in financial services. My background in politics has been a local councillor in Glasgow, and coming into Parliament and seeing the kind of level of influence of money, of the way in which things operate here. And this report really helps to clarify a lot of those levels of influence and the way in which those things work. And the system, I suppose, of all of this is riddled with conflicts of interest. So people who have been in one sector moved into politics or moved into politics, one way or the other, backwards and forwards. And what I found very interesting actually in the report was the kind of backgrounds of all people on the Bank of England policy committees as well, because I don't think I've ever seen that written down anywhere. And that's really quite useful actually to get a picture of where people are coming from in this. And there's a lot of people will say of politics, oh yes, you need people with experience coming in. And that's true, you need a wide range of backgrounds of people coming into politics, that's been true. Experience feeds into that conflict of interest and feeds into that influence for a particular sector is where you start to have serious problems here. And that's before you start to talk about the levels of money coming into the system, either through direct payments to people for giving speeches or for a very lucrative day's work, which most people don't get access to, and lobbying and all-party groups as well. And the influence of all-party groups in this place is something I've taken a wee bit of an interest in because of some of the experience I've had in being approached by lobbyists for this. And if folk haven't seen the article by Peter Geoghegan on open democracy about some of the influence of all-party groups, I would certainly recommend you look at it. There's certainly more to be talked about with the financial sector and all-party groups as well, because that gets you a lot of access in this place. It gets you dinners, it gets you events, it gets you all kinds of things, that money, and it certainly brings that influence as well. And the issue of revolving doors and the COBA recommendations, everything else, has been certainly journalistically covered in private eye for many, many years about people coming in and out and all that, but we saw it quite starkly when the Treasury Select Committee was taking evidence on the Greensill scandal as well, about the significant influence that they certainly felt they were buying and having to put Cameron work for them, and the way in which he approached that as well, and going out and to lobby all of the people that he knew to try and get that support as well. And I know these things are, you know, to some extent in emails and WhatsApps and everything else accessible and searchable. We can see how that is, but we don't always get to see behind the scenes of how that influence works and what those conversations and all of those meetings that the financial sector has with ministers, with influential MPs. You don't always get to see that, and you don't always get to see whose interests in the end that serves. And for me, quite often that isn't my constituents. You know, that is very, very far away from the lives of my constituents in Glasgow Central, who don't have a local bank branch, can struggle to access banking at all, and getting bank accounts, who find the financial sector something very, very far away and distant from them, regardless of how much they try to spin their value to society. So I think there's a lot to be done there, and I think we need to be quite careful as politicians of the stories that we get spun as well, because they do have access and they do have influence, and we do need to be mindful that the evidence, I'm always mindful certainly the evidence that I get from people either in committee or meetings or other things, there's always another side to that, there's always a story to be spun, and I don't think that is necessarily true of everybody when they get these meetings and when they get this influence. And I think as we go forward from this, when we talk about regulation, regulation is fundamentally important. It holds together the whole structure of our society, and it's as serious as that. We saw with the financial crash, we're watering down regulation will get you, and it really does worry me that we're heading down a similar path, that people have forgotten the very important, the very crucial lessons of that time, and we're just heading in the same direction. So everybody thinks, well, it's all right now, and it's really not. And Brexit has been used as a means of saying, well, let's get rid of all the regulations, let's get rid of all the red tape, let's do all these things, because there's that kind of driving force of saying the City of London is more important than anything else, and we should give them free rein to do as they wish. And again, that's not going to end well. And you know, a good number of people even that I speak to in these sectors don't want that removal of all the regulations either. It's a very small ideological push from a relatively small number of people to get rid of all these regulations. Most people see the value of it, and we shouldn't let those with particular financial interests or Brexiteers or whoever it is say that that isn't important, because it really is, and most people believe it to be true. And I don't know if folk have read the Oliver Bullock books Moneyland and Butler to the World, about the kind of the interests of the City of London and who that serves, and the way in which international global financial systems are kind of corrupted for the needs of the super wealthy and those who wish to hide their money around the world. But if we water down regulation yet further, it's bad enough as it is in many ways, but if we water it down yet further, we're only going to make that problem worse. And I think there's a responsibility that we have as politicians to look at the situation that it is, to look at who the systems serve, and to try and do everything we can to make sure that the systems, the regulations, everything, the rules that are in place are robust and that they can't be circumvented in the way in which many of these interests wish them to be. And from my own point of view, as an SNP MP, I'm of course looking at this from a slightly different perspective to that seems like most people in this room. I want Scotland to be an independent country, and I want to see how our systems are set up to avoid making the same mistakes, because we have a really exciting opportunity in Scotland to start a new state. As everyone says, well, with regulation, you can't even start from here. Where would you start from? And what do you learn from the systems that we have here to avoid the worst excesses of that system in an independent Scotland as well? So that's something that I give thought to as well. These kinds of reports are very useful in my thinking of how we approach that too.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, really good to have your contributions. I guess I'd like to pick up on 2 points maybe. First of all, obviously the kind of figures in the report are quite shocking in terms of money going directly to individuals, and that tends towards a narrative in the media of like, oh, they're all the same, all politicians are the same. Like, how do you push back against that? Is there kind of potential for cross-party work on actually looking at getting money, especially for the finance sector, out of politics? Is that an area you're thinking about? And then I guess the second thing I just wanted to pick up on is the deregulation, and it's good to hear some of the conversations you're having, even within people within the finance sector that potentially don't like the direction of travel from this government on, again, making the City of London international competitiveness, deregulation, and taking us back to where we were pre-crash. And again, how can is there some kind of counter to that that's hopeful that we can hear about in terms of the conversations having in Parliament? So it'd be great if you could just talk a bit more about those two aspects, and then I'll bring David back in.
I don't want to be too cheeky to Tories that aren't in the room here, but there's a very clear pattern of who's getting financial donations here. And I don't know if the SNP are included in the 0.5% others of getting financial donations, but I certainly am not aware of my party taking very much money from the financial sector. But I won't go down the easy route, I suppose, of tarring all the Conservatives as a brush on this. There are some very good and principled folk out there, and I think where we can build those cross-party ties and work with those principled members across the House, that's where there are certainly gains to be made. And I think there's always benefit in tightening up those lobbying rules, tightening up the money that you get washing around in this system. And certainly when I see people giving speeches in Parliament, I'm slightly kind of like, oh, yes, I wonder where that's coming from. I always have a wee look at the register of interest just to see who's paying that particular paper. So there's definitely cross-party work that can be done there. There's improvements that can be made. A lot of chat recently, of course, of the standards in public life and the importance of those. There's debate on that later on today as well. And I think that's something that we should all adhere to in these times. Your other point was around
deregulation. Just like, what's the counter to that at the moment? Is there a conversation building that says we don't want to go back to where we were?
Yeah, I think we should at every opportunity remind people of where we got to with that, of where the deregulation and letting financial institutions do what they like, where that ends up for all of us. That we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't sacrifice, the relative gains that we made in regulation to the idea of we have to do these things because Brexit, because of where we are in the world, all this kind of stuff. I don't think those sacrifices are worth making, and I don't think either will give us the gains that people think of them. There's very little evidence, I think, to see that deregulation is where we need to go and what will actually result from.
Great, thank you. I'll bring you back in, David, before we open it up. I spoke at the beginning around some of our ideas, and on an individual basis, we find cross-party support for things like regional banks, even for things like keeping bank branches open. And at the same time, there is legislation being pushed that takes us further from a more balanced banking sector, which would serve the whole of the UK and less of it just itself. The work that you and the team have done on this report, what does it tell you about the likelihood of future finance in terms of, like, whilst we have this seemingly, at least politicians saying they support the idea of breaking the power of finance in the city, getting some regional banks, do you think it will actually happen in terms of where we are?
Yeah, I think unfortunately we can put forward as many well-crafted proposals as we want on how to improve the system and reduce our dependence on the financial system. But as long as there is this grip over policymakers, as long as there is this level of financial ties and the revolving door, and just the fact that so many policymakers are socialized in the financial sector, they have networks in the financial sector, they adopt ideologies from the financial sector. I think that even though it seems like there is cross-party support for certain progressive financial proposals, I think it is very unlikely that we will actually get the legislation to back that up until we address some of these issues of power, right? And I also did just want to come back to a few points that Alison made, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just because you mentioned the APPGs, and I think this is an important issue. There are 750 APPGs, and there's actually a lack of transparency over their funding sources. So the article you mentioned from Open Democracy, they requested disclosures from APPGs, and many of them provided those statements, and so they were able to put together some figures, and actually on financial sector contributions to APPGs. Included in that data, there was HSBC, which is one of the biggest donors to the China APPG, and also Visa and Revolut have paid pretty significant sums to the Fourth Industrial Revolution APPG and the Internet Communications and Technology APPG, both of which consider digital policy. But there are many APPGs that did not disclose their funding sources because they're not required to. And so, there's a lack of transparency here. And what I was hoping was, if BIM were here, I was thinking we could maybe find some areas of overlap, some things, proposals in here that we all agree on. And I think proposals on transparency, surely there can be cross-party support for. Surely we can all agree that transparency and accountability is a good thing. Strengthening standards for the registration of interests, requiring more details on the content of meetings with government ministers, a better lobbying register. All of these things, it should just be obvious, and I think that's a very first step towards actually creating a political system where we can have these more progressive policy proposals implemented. And also on the deregulation point, I think another area where I was hoping we could find some cross-party support is the idea of a joint financial services committee to provide in-depth scrutiny over changes to legislation. This is something that BIM has supported, and even some industry voices have supported, and we think that would provide greater accountability as more power shifts to the regulators with the new regulatory framework. The only thing is we need to make sure that committee is not stacked full of MPs that have ties to the financial sector, right? Or else it might just become another avenue for.
That's the rest, but there's also the kind of the need for expertise in very detailed bits of financial legislation. The European Parliament committees go through this legislation in ridiculous detail, and I'm not quite sure that we have the setup in this Parliament to take on that expertise individually as members of Parliament either.
Massive resource gap.
Yeah,
Obviously,
it's a big
civil
resource gap.
society is tiny that is
Yes.
trying to put forward a case for finance to serve society. So yeah, there are huge challenges ahead, but some ideas in the pipeline.
Maybe just because you mentioned the European Parliament, I think it is also worth noting that in Europe, one way in which MEPs addressed this lack of expertise was that 22 MEPs following the financial crisis set up Finance Watch, which is a civil society organization representing the public interest to provide technical expertise on these matters. In the UK, not only did we not get an equivalent to Finance Watch, but instead the government set up the City UK, which is an industry lobby group, right? So they actually improved the capacity for the financial sector to lobby the government and to advocate and restore trust in the financial sector following the crash.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with what's been happening in the UK finance sector. So yeah, thank you very much, David and Alison. I want to bring in the audience, both in person and online. And I think in order to do that, what we found is that to get better questions, we like to talk to each other first. So I'm going to let the people in the audience just have a chat with the person next to you about what you've heard, any questions you want to ask or clarifying questions. There are also copies of the report to have a look at. And for those online, we'd like you to join a poll, and we're just going to send you the details. So you go to the website, slido.com, which you should be able to see, which should be sent to you, and you put in this hashtag, which is the power of finance, and you'll be asked a series of questions, so you can join in the conversation. And we'll just put you through a few questions. So go to slido.com, open a new tab in your browser on the internet, type slido.com, then next to the hashtag, put in power of finance, and you will shortly see a question. And those in the audience can obviously do the same as well. But I'm going to let the audience in person have a chat with their neighbour, and we're going to come back in 5 minutes. For those online, just to see what the support is for some of the proposals. So which aspects of the financial lobby do you think are harmful to democracy? So 95% of people thought financial ties with parliamentarians, 81% thought unequal access to government meetings, and 81% thought the revolving door positions with regulators on private finance. So a lot of support for that analysis. And then the next question was, what is the most effective way to reclaim our democracy from big finance? So the most supported idea was strengthen the conflict of interest rules for politicians, then ban regulators from holding positions of private finance, then cap political party donations, then improve civil society access to financial policymakers, and finally create a public digital payment method. So support for all of those. And finally, we asked how much do you trust policymakers to create a finance sector which serves the interests of society at large. And I think around 86% said 1 out of 5, so pretty low. And no percent said 5 out of 5. So everyone's feeling quite pessimistic, which is unsurprising, but we're here to kind of talk about how we can strengthen the movement for change. So I'm gonna, first pose a few questions to the panel that were submitted. So Nikki Burnett submitted a question on green finance. So what can Parliament do to stop big banks, notably Barclays and HSBC, funding climate chaos? They are investing billions in fossil fuel industry, including exploration for new oil and gas, when we know if current reserves are bad, global warming will exceed Paris and Glasgow limits. I'll ask rounds of 3 questions. So the second one I'll share was from Sunil, who said, isn't it time to break up big financial institutions and big tech firms? isn't there a need to not allow big tech to come into finance? And the last one I'll ask is from Andrew Downs. How can those invested in the status quo be persuaded by a vision of a more equitable society? So, Alison, do you want to pick up on any of those first, and then I'll come to you, David?
Sure. I'll take the one around green finance, because it's been playing on my mind quite a bit. We've been talking about this in committee and more widely, because COP26 was, of course, in my constituency in Glasgow, so I was quite interested in where that goes. And there's an awful lot of talk around improving the way in which global finance actually funds the green economy rather than funding oil and gas and all those other things. And I think what I'm worried about most at the moment is greenwashing, about companies pretending they're actually doing something about this, when in fact they're continuing as business as usual. And I think that we need to be quite careful about how that then is regulated, about how people are going to produce all these reports and say all these fantastic things that they're doing, when in fact they're not. We need to find ways of interrogating those reports, interrogating that behaviour, and trying to hold companies to account for what they're actually doing. Because again, we see some of what they're doing, we don't see all of what they're doing. And I think the road which they're going down in terms of greenwashing should worry us all, because I think we need to make sure that there's accountability there for what people are funding. I also think it's quite important that we keep making the case for investment in the green economy, because there's significant new jobs coming from that, new technologies, ways in which we can better heat and insulate our homes, a whole load of opportunities coming along there. It's a very investable area, and it absolutely baffles me that the government in what they announced last week is basically giving a big tax break from oil and gas exploration, rather than saying, look, this is what we need to be doing. We've committed to these climate targets. We need to actually put a whole lot more effort behind meeting those targets. But instead, you can have tax breaks for oil exploration. It's absolutely baffling to me why you do that, as if people have forgotten that COP26 actually happened at all. And I think the more pressure that we can put on government and society and big companies as a whole to invest more in the green economy, that's where we should be going with this, because the opportunities are massive, absolutely massive, and we need to keep talking about that and keep pushing that as much as we can.
Great. Bring you in, David, on that and the other questions.
Yeah, sure. I'll touch on all of them. So first on, what can Parliament do to stop big banks funneling money into fossil fuels? I mean, Nikki's absolutely right that UK banks are financing fossil fuels to the tune of tens of billions, and that since the Paris Agreement, Barclays and HSBC combined have channeled, I think, close to 240 billion pounds into fossil fuels. So I think the thing that Parliament can do right now is they can ensure that in the new regulatory framework in the Financial Services Markets Bill that's about to go through Parliament, that they include an objective for regulators to align with the Paris Agreement, right? And we need to be very clear about what alignment with the Paris Agreement means, because as Alison mentioned, there's a big danger of greenwashing. And so alignment with the Paris Agreement, at the very least, has to mean alignment with the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario, which shows that we can have no new fossil fuel expansion and exploration beyond what was committed to in 2021. So that is, I think, the bare minimum that Parliament can do on that issue. And then, regulators need to accept that they have a role in shaping the financial system and not just in managing risks, right? Regulators used to play this role in economies, post World War II. They were, really supporting economic development. And now we have this idea that regulators should just focus on these very narrow mandates. And that means that we're losing out on a bunch of policy tools that could actually help us achieve that are necessary to achieve a fair and sustainable economy. On the question about breaking up large financial institutions and tech firms, I mean, I would be inclined to agree with that we should. I think at the same time, even if that doesn't happen, I think their power shows the importance of at least reducing dependence on them. So even if they continue to exist, we should have a public payment system, and we should have more banking options, right? If people aren't happy with their bank, they really don't have many options. You can go to the next big bank that's behaving exactly the same way. And I think the involvement of tech firms in finance is a big danger. We've talked a lot about Facebook and its plans to introduce a stable coin, and we think this shows how urgent it is to have a public digital money option. And then on the last question on can those with vested interests be persuaded by a vision of a more equitable society, I think that was the question. I would say I don't think they can be persuaded in the time frame that they need to be persuaded, and that's why we need better rules, right? We can't rely on voluntary, goodwill of those that have vested interests. We need to really, I think, create a movement and push for new rules, right? And this is part of what we're aiming to achieve with this report.
Thanks, David. I'd like to bring in the audience here in person, which is very novel. Has anyone got a question to ask? Hang on a minute, I'm just going to see your hands and see if there's 3, maybe I can take at a time. Okay, 1 more. Okay, oh, we've got 4 hands. Okay, we'll go for 2 of you, and then we'll come down to the 2 of you. Oh, actually, we'll go to the 2 of you, answer the question, and then we'll come back.
Okay. Well, first I'd like to congratulate the Positive Money team on this report, which is one of the best and most important, in my opinion, they've ever produced. We've had some mention of regulation and laws, and I'd just like to mention some adjacent issue which MPs will ought to look at, which is that company law for all companies requires executives to operate on behalf of shareholders, which in practice means operate in terms of financial profit. The law ought to say operate in terms of to the benefit of shareholders, except where it conflicts with community, national interest or whatever. But the law doesn't say that, and it should. So MPs could look at that, and it would be good if they did.
Thank you. Just to repeat for the online audience, in case you didn't hear, it was around company law that says that they should be looking at their shareholder profits.
No, but the law only says that.
Only says
and
that.
It should say, in addition,
Exactly.
where it does not conflict with community and national and environmental issues.
It doesn't look at community, national, environmental issues. Thank you.
I have 2 quick questions. So the first is, when you mention financial institutions in the report, do you mean banking institutions, or are you taking into account insurance companies, asset managers, and so on and so forth? Because I see they're used interchangeably in some places, and they're completely different to a certain aspect. And my second question is, there are 2 regulators, one for the banking piece, which is usually any money lending activities, and then there's the investments and securities and so on and so forth. And this exists in every country, even in the UK. I just wanted to ask, have you seen a difference in regulation? Because in the industry, I'm in the financial industry, and we've seen that the banking regulator is significantly more lax when it comes to things like advertising, where you don't have to write capital at risk. If something happens to a bank, they get bailed out. Investment companies don't. So it really deters people from keeping their money in real assets and real investments, and gives this illusion that the bank is the safest place when they're profiting off money lending activities, when we could be keeping our money in productive assets. And there's a huge difference. So when there's a conversation happening in government, do people talk about these interchangeably? Because today investments are not how they used to be. It's very liquid. You wouldn't necessarily need money because investments are so liquid, so fractional. You could trade pieces of property, right? That could be money. So those are my 2 questions.
Okay, great. Just to repeat those for those online. So the first one was a definitional question around what we mean by finance sector in the report, whether it includes insurance companies. And the second one was around investment, and basically, should we, the issue around how the lax regulation when it comes to advertising and investment by banks, and that limiting the ability for the for everyday people to get their money into productive assets. I would like to go to David first. Would you like to pick on some of those points?
Sure. Well, we addressed the one on what we mean by financial institutions. So we have a footnote clarifying this in the report because it is important to be clear on this. So when we talk about the financial sector in this report, sometimes we also use the term for-profit financial institutions or financial sector firms. We're talking about banks, investment firms, insurance companies, hedge funds, the whole financial sector. The only institutions that we have excluded, for the most part, from our analyses, are institutions that have a very clear purpose-driven mission, right? So those that are not primarily driven by profit maximization, essentially. So yeah, then on the regulators, that's a good question. And is there a difference in regulators? Is one more strict than? I mean, this isn't something that we've looked into in much detail. I think either way, what needs to happen right now is that the regulatory framework should ensure that regulators don't become cheerleaders for big finance, whether it's banking or investment firms or whatever else, and that they are actually, ensuring that financial institutions are aligned with public interest. So that's for us with the legislation that's about to go through Parliament. That's the essential thing, and that I think is valid even if one regulator is maybe a bit more strict at the moment than the other. We need to make sure that the right rules and the right framework is in place. On the point about company laws, I completely agree with that. And I think, in the financial sector, customers, we do need to increase, we need to support this movement of institutions that do have different ownership models. So there are institutions in the financial sector whose primary mission is not maximizing shareholder value. And so I think it's essential that we support those institutions and that we also tweak, ensure that, again, the regulatory review that's happening right now levels the playing field so that these smaller, mutually owned institutions and so on face fewer barriers.
Brilliant. Alison, do you want to pick up on any of those questions?
Yeah, I think that last point was very important. I was going to say that you need to be careful, I suppose, in how you set those objectives. Just what you might define as the national interest might not be what I define as the national interest. If you were to kind of widen out those responsibilities as well, so you have to be quite careful how those are defined.
Well, it would be up to the courts in the end if there was a legal requirement that they should.
That sounds very good for lawyers.
And but if it was in the law that they should be taking account, then the arguments can start.
Yeah.
At the moment, there's no place to even discuss it.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting point, certainly, and there's been lots of widening out of objectives for different institutions, the FCA and everything else. So I think perhaps there's time to consider that as well in terms of business responsibilities too, if those are going to be widened out. The point that you make around rules for different regulators, I think what concerns me more is actually the gaps and the inconsistencies. And I say that because I had a meeting yesterday with people who were affected by the Blackmore bond scandal, who have been badly let down by regulators. And I think there's a big piece that needs to be done here around sort of public education, really, about how you invest in things, how you go about this, and how you make sure that you don't lose everything. Because I've seen too many people who have thought they knew what they were doing, went into things in good faith, felt as though they'd done enough due diligence to know that their money would be safe, and yet, you've got scandals like Blackmore Bond, like LCF, like Football Index, in which there's a debate later on today, where people ended up losing everything because of those gaps in regulation. And the Football Index one seemed to get batted back between the FCA and the gambling regulator about whose responsibility it was to actually look at this and regulate it. So I think I would like to see those gaps and those inconsistencies filled to make sure that people are protected, rather than necessarily making it easier for people to put money into different things. Better for, I suppose, for them to be in productive assets, certainly, but people have to have that assurance that when they're putting that money in, they're not going to lose everything in the end as well.
Thank you.
Great. We'll come to these two questions and then we'll bring some online. You had a question, sir?
Yes, it's tied into two questions. The first one is there's a lot of talk about UK, lots of things mentioning UK all the while. And the problem is that the UK finance and the services and benefits that people in the UK get is so tightly linked to the global international finance as well. And I get the indication, the question to me is, you seem to not appreciate that fact. You give that impression, I think, okay? Now, on that though, when you change the regulation and things like that, that is you may be intending for the UK only, but it will have an effect on the global finance part. And my worry is, and my question to you is, how are you going to compensate the finances of London, the UK, for the loss that we're going to suffer from the finances, which will just simply move to another country if you change the regulations and make it difficult? Because the people that will suffer are not the people at the top with the money. They just buy another property in another country and move. What will be damaged in this country is the poor, the vulnerable, those that cannot move, and those who don't have the intellect, if you like, to find a compensation for the losses of the finance and services that they are likely to suffer from your change to the regulations that just forces that finance and money to go overseas.
Okay, question.
Quick question specifically for Alison, I suppose. How many of the 12 recommendations in the report do you anticipate finding their way to the next SNP manifesto?
Oh, very specific question. We like that. Okay, well, why don't you answer the first one, David, in terms of like, what we're saying, do you believe that actually potentially shrinking big finance, regulating it, bringing it into line, would it have an effect on those that need support most in terms of the UK and the connection to the global finance sector?
Yeah, and maybe just briefly before I come to that, I did also just remember one thing that was relevant to a previous question on company law. There was a recent High Court ruling it was two charitable foundations that were requesting that the law be changed so that they could sacrifice financial returns so that they could meet social and environmental objectives, and the court ruled in their favor. So they are now actually allowed to forego financial returns, which they weren't allowed to before. So I think that sets quite an important precedent. So coming to your question, sir, I think it's a really important point. I think what we find in the research, and not in this report, we reference this research, but in lots of academic research, is that continued growth of the financial sector is not actually good for the wider economy, right? So some financial sector development, it goes like this. So some is good for the wider economy. The financial sector supports the economy. And then as it grows further and further, eventually it starts extracting from the economy, and it starts to hinder our society from flourishing. Some refer to this as the finance curse. So we think that actually shrinking the UK's financial sector would not necessarily be a bad thing. Of course, there are ways in which this could be done in a very unequal way, and there are ways that it could be done in a more progressive way. And I think the main problem here is that, as I mentioned towards the end of my presentation earlier, we do have an economy that, as it currently exists in its current structure, is heavily dependent on the financial sector. So we do need to address some of those structural dependencies as we implement some of these more stringent regulations to ensure that the shrinking of the sector does happen in a way that is fair and that doesn't lead to the most vulnerable losing out.
Talk to you later.
Yeah, it'd be great for you to come in, Alison, on the specific question, but also maybe talking about, you talked a little bit about your constituents and the challenges they can face in terms of bank branches being withdrawn and not being able to access the basic need, which is to make payments. And obviously, that's in the current system where we have these huge international banks in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in terms of, you know, the folk that I was talking about, the constituents I've got that can't get access to bank accounts, that I've seen the local branches closing, you're not seeing very much from this financial system at the moment. That if there is, you know, great wealth and everything else, it's certainly not reaching a lot of people. And that, for me, is part of a reason to not to kind of go too far to that argument. And I'm also never sure that if we don't do it, somebody else will, is the best argument or the best basis for having any system, and particularly for global finance, because it does lead to that race to the bottom, and it does sort of, you end up undercutting other places rather than building up standards, which I think is where we should be looking to go to.
My point is, it's got to be operated globally. I think if you just do things locally,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
you'll just make yourself suffer,
Yeah.
and no one else.
Yeah, and I think
Other people benefit because it moves.
And I think using the influence that's there, which is significant, for a good purpose to improve those standards, to try and make that the system which exists where money is extracted and hidden away in different parts of the world rather than actually staying here and being used for good purpose to reach my constituents and folk who need that investment. I think that using that influence for good to raise standards rather than trying to cut standards to try and chase that money, when there's always going to be people that will cut standards more than we will. You know, I think
That's what it needs to be global.
Yeah, it needs to be global. I mean, absolutely. And getting to that kind of global standard where you've got all your big financial nations working together on this to try and push those people out of that system. It's difficult to achieve, but I would like to be optimistic about that.
Yes, I accept that.
Looking at the recommendations on the list of these, and a lot of these, I would say I would have a problem with having in an SNP manifesto. Whether we get to a little bit Westminster election where I stand again, I don't know. We've got other objectives for that. But certainly, lobbying register has already been improved in the Scottish Parliament significantly from what we have now. Second jobs, again, that's something broadly that we have a principle there. Registration of interests, certainly that's something that we have no problem in supporting. Stuff around lobbying, donations, again, we want to see that strengthened. UK government is looking at a lot of the stuff around the Electoral Commission and how those donations are going to be registered in the future. Ministerial code, obviously something that we were broadly in favour of, because that is really significant. I'm not quite sure what the reporting is for Scottish ministers under the code in Scotland, but certainly publishing that on a monthly basis, I would see that being hugely problematic. On the broad principles of a financial sector, services sector, which is accountable and transparent, again, we'll see no kind of complaints from the SNP on that front. So these are very technical kind of issues for even the Bank of England, the FCA to implement. But broadly, those principles of transparency and accountability are things that we would like to uphold. And as I said, things that I would like to see them in Scotland as well. If you're building the system from scratch, you can start building these principles from day one.
So in summary, what's not to like?
Yeah, I should say writing the manifesto is a broad line.
No, you must carry that, right? We get that.
Okay.
Yeah, but those broad principles in here are not things that I would dispute.
I'm just going to take 2 more questions from those that are joining online, and then we're going to bring it to a close. I'm just checking there isn't any more burning questions in the audience. Okay, so yeah, I'd really like to take your question. I'll come to you first. Look, I'll do these questions first, then I'll come to you. So Tom says, how much do parliamentarians know about banking amongst the many things they are supposed to legislate over? I'd like Alison's view on this. Beyond political contributions, don't lobbyists bring most of the information to the table when it comes to writing the law? So how can we solve this? Or as a colleague said, they end up marking their own homework, which isn't an ideal situation. And then I'll come in and bring your question in as well. Do you want to go?
Tell you what we said. Right. Well, I haven't had a chance to read about the international competitiveness part of the report, but I think that probably touches on what you're talking about. So I'm quite interested in what is the reason people say that they want the international competitiveness. Is that a false narrative? And what are the reasons that it is not a good thing?
Great. So just in case those online didn't hear, is the international competitiveness a false narrative, and why is it not a good thing, or is it a good thing? And I know David wants to pick up on that one. So I'll come to you first, Alison, and any final comments you want to make.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure, and the people who've spoken to at committee on this, whether it's even something that is achievable when you balance it out with all the other objectives regulators have. And like we were saying earlier, I think it feels as though it's something that's being pushed as an objective, but whether it or not it's actually achievable or desirable, it remains to be seen. If you give that objective to regulators, whether or not they can actually do anything with it, I'm not quite sure. Because if they're looking to protect all the structures and make sure that we've got a robust system, does that even fit well with those other objectives that exist? I'm not quite sure.
And the other question, around how much do parliamentarians know? And Laurie's bringing the knowledge, and that's why.
Never enough is the answer to for the politicians. Never enough. And I always feel a duty to try and seek as wide information as I can on any issue, but legislation is complex, and we have a finance bill every year. We have a whole host of measures that get added onto the tax codes, everything else. Hugely complex. I mean, the last finance bill was stuff with equations in it, which I think if you put equations into your legislation, there's something quite wrong about that as well. So never enough is the answer to that, and we have to take as much wide advice as we can. But yeah, you do get lobbying groups from various different sectors coming to you and this is the solution, take this, read this, say it out loud into Hansard, this is very easy, very simple. And that's quite difficult, particularly when you put the pace of business in this place as well. Things can come up you very, very fast. It's difficult to get the depth of knowledge that you need on any given subject. And that's certainly a challenge for the way that we operate, the way the legislation read, and the responsibilities that we have to legislate.
Thanks, Alison. David, would you want to come in with the answer to those questions and any final remarks?
Sure. So yeah, the international competitiveness objective, it existed before the financial crisis, and we believe, and many regulators and parliamentarians have expressed that they believe that it contributed to the light touch regulation that led to the financial crisis. And now it's being pushed by the financial sector because essentially it means, go easy on us, let us grow and grow and grow and grow, support us in our growth. And initially, the government, and they might still be looking at this, it was going to be a growth and international competitiveness objective, so economic growth and competitiveness. But UK Finance, the lobby group, and possibly some others, in their evidence that they submitted to the inquiry, the call for evidence on this, argued that it should just be international competitiveness, because they don't even want an objective to support economic growth, because I think they know that that is not actually consistent with their continued growth. I guess maybe also coming back while we're on this to the point about global finance, this is something that we are very aware of, and we have we're starting to plan a project on the international monetary and financial system, and we worked with organizations in Europe to set up Positive Money Europe, which has been around for a few years now, and we're also we just set up Positive Money US. So we are trying to push for these changes on an international scale. I think another aspect that's maybe relevant to your question is that we often forget the spending capacity that the government also has, and that is, it's not like all money is coming from the financial sector. What really matters is the real resources in the economy, and are we deploying those resources for good purposes? And if the financial sector, does shrink to some extent in the UK, they're using fewer resources, less labor, the government can deploy those resources, right, to achieve better ends. So that's another factor. But I think the main point I wanted to get across is that we are, pushing for regulatory changes at the international level. I think that was all.
Great.
No final questions?
No, unless you have any final remarks, I'll wrap up.
I would just say thank you all so much for being here and for tuning in. It's been a great discussion. And if you have any questions about the report, do please get in touch. Happy to share further thoughts or any of our data or anything else. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Great. So thank you to our panelists. Fewer than we were hoping for, so they've had to do a lot of extra work, so we very much appreciate your contributions, and to all the report authors, and also very much thanks to our audience, both those in person and online. I also want to thank our funders for this project, which are Partners for a New Economy, without which we couldn't have done the work. And just a thanks to the whole Positive Money team working hard on the event, getting the message out on the power of big finance. If you haven't seen the video that we've launched today, please check it out online, whether that's on Twitter, Facebook, all the usual places. The more of us that see this and share it, the better. And so for those of you joining us in person, the Positive Money team are going to go and grab a coffee. If you want to carry on the discussion, we'd really welcome you to join. But I'll say goodbye to those online and thank you for joining.
Goodbye.
Tell me firstly maybe why you decided to come to the event. Like what drew you to it?
My name is Matej Roska. I'm a reporter for a new investigative journalistic website called Reporter.London, and I've come here because I'm interested in more transparency around lobbying and political rulemaking and stuff like that, and I thought that the report was very useful as a resource for the future to have all the data in one place around how much money is being poured into politics by the financial sector and how different political parties and legislators are taking advantage of this situation. So I congratulate the Positive Money think tank on the research, and I thought it was a very useful event for reporters.
I've been a follower of Positive Money for a long time, but this is the first time I've actually been to an event in person. I just wanted to congratulate Positive Money, actually, because really interesting report, really important report, and a really great event. The question I should have asked was, I think this is the right time for this report, given so many of the recommendations are about parliamentary standards and parliamentary lobbying and parliamentary second jobs, and it seems to me it's unfinished business. There's so much work to be done around this, and it feels like, given last night's Conservative confidence vote, then really now's the time to start lobbying for this. Thank you.
Any other feedback about the event? Or, I mean, you kind of covered it there. Anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I haven't read the report yet, just read the summary. Great presentation from David. I think what's really striking about it is everyone knows, to some degree, the power of the financial services sector, but I had no idea quite how influential and how deeply embedded in our government that sector is. So this report is really striking and important.